Welcome to another deep dive. This time, it's something uniquely Canadian. We're talking about collective rights.
Rights held by specific groups.
Exactly. Not just individuals.
Many countries,
Yeah.
they focus on individual rights.
Yeah.
But what's interesting about Canada is that it goes a step further. It actually enshrines these collective rights right into its constitution.
That is a key difference for sure.
Yeah.
And it sets the stage for how Canada has approached, well, everything.
Right.
From Indigenous land claims to language laws.
Exactly.
Mm.
And today we're going to kind of explore the stories,
Okay.
the legal battles,
Uh-huh.
the ongoing debates surrounding three, I guess you could say, key groups.
Okay.
Indigenous peoples, Francophones, and Anglophones.
All right, so let's unpack this. It's a long history.
It is.
So where do we even begin?
Well, you really can't talk about collective rights in Canada without going back to the Royal Proclamation of 1763.
Okay.
King George III
Right.
issued this document, and it acknowledged First Nations land rights,
Okay.
and it really set the stage for treaty negotiations.
All right.
It's fascinating,
Yeah.
because it was initially meant to prevent conflicts with American colonists,
Okay.
but it ended up shaping
Right.
the very foundation of Canada's relationship with Indigenous peoples.
So, like, this one document had a ripple effect.
Absolutely.
That continues to this day.
Yeah.
Wow.
And those ripples led to the Numbered Treaties,
Okay.
a series of agreements between First Nations and the Canadian government.
Mm-hmm.
So you see, these treaties, particularly treaties 6, 7, and 8, which directly impact Alberta, promise things like
Yeah.
annual payments, medical care, farming assistance,
Okay.
in exchange for sharing the land.
Okay.
However,
Yeah.
the interpretation and the implementation of these treaties has been a source of tension and debate ever since.
It sounds like there were fundamental differences in understanding right from the start.
Precisely. Take, for example, Cree leaders like Poundmaker and Big Bear, who initially resisted the treaties. Their worldview saw the land as indivisible,
Okay.
as something you simply can't carve up and trade away.
Right.
This clash of perspectives is further highlighted by the different ways the agreements were recorded.
Oh, okay.
First Nations relied on oral tradition,
Okay.
passed down through generations,
Uh-huh.
while the government
Yeah.
used written documents in English.
Yeah, of course.
It's no wonder disagreements arose over time.
Yeah.
It's like trying to bridge two completely different worlds.
Exactly.
And then came the Indian Act in 1876.
Okay.
This legislation aimed to assimilate First Nations into Canadian society.
Uh-huh.
But it did so in ways that many today would consider deeply problematic.
This is where it gets really interesting.
Yeah.
The Indian Act, even with revisions, is still in effect today.
Right.
Some argue it's outdated and needs to be repealed,
Yeah.
while others believe it's still necessary to protect Indigenous rights. What are the key arguments on each side of this debate?
Well, those who support the Act's repeal,
Yeah.
they argue that it's paternalistic
Okay.
and continues to infringe on First Nations' right to self-determination.
Uh-huh.
They point to provisions that controlled Indigenous governance,
Right.
restricted their movement,
Okay.
and even outlawed cultural practices
Yeah.
as evidence of its harmful legacy.
Uh-huh.
On the other hand,
Yeah.
those who favor keeping the Act,
Okay.
at least in some form,
Okay.
argue that it provides important legal protections
Uh-huh.
and ensures federal funding for essential services.
So it's not a simple yes or no situation?
Not at all.
Right.
It's a complex issue with valid points on both sides.
Uh-huh.
And it speaks to the ongoing challenges of reconciling Canada's colonial past with its commitment to Indigenous rights in the present.
Yeah.
But even more controversial
Yeah.
than the Indian Act
Yeah.
is the legacy of residential schools.
Right.
You can't talk about Indigenous rights without acknowledging this dark chapter in Canada's history.
Right. We have John A. Macdonald's own words from 1883.
Yeah.
And they're pretty chilling. He actually justified removing Indigenous children from their families to assimilate them into Euro-Canadian culture.
And these institutions caused lasting trauma for generations.
Yeah.
A pain that the government's formal apology in 2008 couldn't erase.
Right. And this leads us to movements like Idle No More
Right.
and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's 94 calls to action.
Exactly.
Right. They feel like a direct response to that historical trauma.
They are.
Yeah.
Idle No More was a powerful grassroots movement
Uh-huh.
asserting Indigenous sovereignty,
Yeah.
and demanding action on issues like land rights
Okay.
and environmental protection.
Right.
And the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, while focusing on the legacy of residential schools, also provided a roadmap for a more just and equitable future for Indigenous peoples. But the fight for Indigenous rights
Yeah.
isn't confined to the past.
Right.
Issues like land claims,
Mm-hmm.
resource extraction,
Yeah.
and the ongoing impacts of colonialism
Yeah.
continue to fuel debate and activism today.
Okay. So it's clear that the relationship between Indigenous peoples and the Canadian government is still evolving.
Absolutely.
So how does this all connect to the collective rights of Francophones and Anglophones?
Well, the fight for Indigenous rights
Uh-huh.
often intersects with the struggle for language recognition,
Okay.
as we see in the journey of Canada's official language groups.
Right.
It's a fascinating story.
Uh-huh.
That starts way back in 1608 with Samuel de Champlain's founding of Quebec,
Okay.
a moment that laid the groundwork for the enduring presence of French language and culture in Canada.
So the seeds of bilingualism were planted right from the beginning.
Yes, but the path to official bilingualism
Huh.
was a long and winding one.
Okay.
It involved key moments,
Yeah.
like the Quebec Act of 1774,
Okay.
which recognized Francophone rights,
Okay.
and Confederation in 1867,
Yeah.
which formally established a bicultural and bilingual nation.
Right.
However,
Yeah.
achieving true equality for both language groups,
Uh-huh.
especially for Francophones outside of Quebec,
Okay.
has been an ongoing challenge.
That makes me think of the Official Languages Act of 1969.
Right.
A pretty significant piece of legislation.
Yeah,
Didn't it reassert the equal status of English and French at the federal level?
it did.
Okay.
And it paved the way for the Charter of Rights and Freedoms in 1982,
Okay.
which solidified these rights
Uh-huh.
by explicitly guaranteeing minority language education rights.
This is where things get really interesting for me. We're talking about real-world impacts now, about Francophone communities across Canada fighting for their right to educate their children in French.
Absolutely.
Wow.
Section 23 of the Charter
Yeah.
was a game changer
Okay.
for minority language education. It gave groups like Francophones in Alberta the legal tools to lobby for and establish their own publicly funded schools and school boards.
Wow.
We'll delve into the specific challenges they faced
Okay.
and the impact this had on communities later on.
All right.
But first,
Yeah.
we need to talk about the elephant in the room when it comes to language rights in Canada.
Okay.
Bill 101 in Quebec.
Ah, yes, the Charter of the French Language. It's been praised for preserving French culture, but also criticized for limiting individual freedoms.
Right.
What are the key arguments on both sides of this debate, and how has the Supreme Court weighed in on this issue?
Well,
Yeah.
Bill 101
Mm-hmm.
was born out of a real concern that the French language was losing ground in Quebec,
Okay.
particularly in the face of the dominance of English in North America.
Yeah.
Supporters argue
Uh-huh.
that it's been essential in protecting and promoting French language and culture,
Okay.
creating a space where French can thrive.
So it's about ensuring that French isn't simply swallowed up.
By the dominance of English. But hasn't this also led to restrictions on businesses and individuals?
Yes.
Okay.
And that's where the criticisms come in.
Yeah.
Opponents argue that some aspects of Bill 101,
Go on.
particularly those related to signage and language restrictions in businesses,
Okay.
infringe on individual freedoms
Right.
and create unnecessary barriers.
Okay.
The Supreme Court
Yeah.
has weighed in on several key aspects of Bill 101.
Uh-huh.
While it upheld the law's requirement for French to be the predominant language on commercial signs,
Right.
it also allowed for the use of English,
Okay.
albeit less prominently.
So it's a balancing act
Right.
between protecting a language and respecting individual rights.
Exactly.
Okay.
And when it comes to education,
Yeah.
the court has upheld the requirement for most children,
Uh-huh.
including those from immigrant families,
Yeah.
to attend French language schools.
Okay.
But it has also affirmed the right of certain groups.
Like those with historical ties to English education in Quebec
Right.
to choose English schools.
Okay.
Yeah.
It sounds like a very complex
Yeah.
and nuanced landscape. Later on, we'll hear from individuals navigating this landscape, both Anglophones and Francophones, to understand how these laws play out in their daily lives.
Yes.
But before we do that,
Right.
I want to circle back to another group whose fight for collective rights has been long and arduous, the Métis.
Métis' story
Yeah.
is one of resilience,
Uh-huh.
perseverance,
Okay.
and, unfortunately, broken promises.
Right.
Unlike First Nations,
Mm-hmm.
they don't have a historical treaty relationship with the Canadian government.
Okay.
This has made their struggle for recognition much more challenging.
So how did the Métis begin to assert their collective rights? Where does their story begin?
Well, their story begins
Yeah.
long before Canada as we know it existed.
Okay.
They emerged as a distinct people with their own unique culture and traditions,
Mm-hmm.
rooted in the fur trade and the blending of Indigenous and European heritages.
Okay.
But their fight for recognition
Right.
as a rights-bearing people
Okay.
really takes shape in the mid-19th century
Okay.
with the Red River Resistance.
This is where Louis Riel comes in, right?
Yes, Louis
Yeah.
Riel. He led the Red River Resistance in 1869,
Right.
a pivotal moment
Mm-hmm.
that ultimately led to the creation of Manitoba
Okay.
and the inclusion of some Metis rights in the Manitoba Act of 1870.
All right.
But the government's actions often fell short of its promises,
Right.
leading to further struggles for the Métis.
One of the most glaring examples is the government's failure to grant the 500,000 hectares of land
Yeah,
promised to the Métis in the Manitoba Act. Instead, they issued scrip,
right.
a document that could be exchanged for land,
Uh-huh.
but often resulted in dispersal
Right.
and loss of community. You can imagine how frustrating
Yeah,
and unfair this must have felt for the Métis.
absolutely. It's a clear example of how government policies, even when seemingly well-intentioned,
Right.
can have devastating consequences,
Mhm.
particularly when they fail to understand or respect the needs of the people they're meant to serve.
Right.
And this wasn't the only challenge
Yeah.
the Métis faced.
They were also often caught in a sort of middle ground, weren't they?
Yes.
Not quite fitting the definition of Indian under the Indian Act,
Right.
but also not recognized as a distinct group with inherent rights.
Exactly.
Okay.
This ambiguity contributed to their struggles for recognition and fueled a series of legal battles that have spanned decades.
Wow.
The Métis have had to fight every step of the way to prove their existence, their history, and their unique connection to the land.
So when did things start to change for the Métis? When did they start to gain legal recognition as a rights-bearing people?
The turning point came with Section 35 of the Constitution Act, 1982.
Okay.
This section, for the first time, acknowledged the Métis as one of Canada's Aboriginal peoples
Okay.
with existing Aboriginal and treaty rights.
Okay.
It was a monumental victory
Wow.
and set the stage for them to assert their rights in new and powerful ways.
It sounds like this opened the door to a whole new era of legal challenges and negotiations for the Métis.
It did.
Wow.
And one of the most significant legal victories in recent years has been the Powley case in 2003.
Okay.
This Supreme Court ruling
Yeah.
was groundbreaking
Okay.
because it went beyond simply acknowledging
Okay.
the Métis as Aboriginal people.
Uh-huh.
It affirmed their specific right to hunt and fish for food,
Right.
recognizing their inherent connection to the land, and setting a precedent for future battles over Métis rights.
So the Powley case wasn't just about hunting and fishing. It was about recognizing the Métis as a distinct people with a unique set of rights.
Precisely.
Wow.
And that fight continues today,
Yeah.
particularly when it comes to land claims stemming from the Manitoba Act. The Métis have been fighting for decades to receive compensation for the land they were promised but never received.
Okay.
A recent Supreme Court ruling in their favor
Uh-huh.
was another hard-won victory,
Okay.
but it's just one step
Yeah.
in a long and ongoing process.
Clearly, the story of the Métis is far from over. They've made significant strides in asserting their collective rights, but they continue to face challenges, particularly when it comes to translating those rights into tangible benefits for their communities.
Their story,
Yeah.
like the stories of Indigenous peoples and the official language groups,
Right.
highlights the complexity
Uh-huh.
and ever-evolving nature
Yeah.
of collective rights in Canada.
It's a reminder that collective rights are not static. They're dynamic forces that continue to shape the very fabric of Canadian society.
Exactly. To really understand the impact of these collective rights, sometimes it helps to hear directly from the people living these realities.
Okay, yeah.
It's one thing to discuss legal frameworks,
Mm-hmm.
but it's another to see how they shape individual lives.
You're right. So let's bring those legal frameworks to life. Who are we hearing from?
First up is Rachel St. Laurent,
Okay.
that grade 10 student attending École Héritage, the Francophone school in Falher, Alberta.
Right.
Her experience speaks to the challenges and rewards of being part of a minority language community.
Imagine being surrounded by English, yet choosing to learn and live in French. What's that like for Rachel?
Well, she grew up in St. Isidore,
Okay.
a small Francophone community near Peace River.
Uh-huh.
French was the dominant language there,
Right.
but she was still aware of the constant presence of English. She talks about the effort it takes to maintain her French
Yeah.
and the worry, even within her own community, that she might lose it.
It must take a lot of dedication to hold on to your language when it's not the dominant one around you.
It does.
Yeah.
And yet Rachel also sees the value in being bilingual.
Okay.
She dreams of becoming a hairdresser and even owning her own business with her friends. She understands that speaking both French and English opens doors in a world that's increasingly interconnected.
So for her, it's not about choosing one language over the other.
No.
It's about embracing both
Right.
and seeing the advantages they offer.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Her story highlights how collective rights can empower individuals to embrace their heritage
Right.
while also pursuing their aspirations.
That's great.
Now let's shift gears and head to Quebec City, where we'll hear from Devin Menz.
Okay.
He's an Anglophone student attending Quebec High School,
Right.
so he offers a contrasting perspective.
This is interesting because it flips the script, right? He's part of the majority language group nationally,
Yeah,
but finds himself in the minority within his own province.
precisely.
Okay.
Devin speaks English at home,
Uh-huh.
and he feels most comfortable expressing himself in English. Attending an English school allows him to connect with his mother tongue,
Right.
which is important for his sense of identity. But he also acknowledges the challenges of navigating everyday life in French.
I bet that's a unique experience being surrounded by French all the time.
He talks about simple things like going to the grocery store or even playing on his baseball team where everyone else is Francophone.
Right.
It's a constant reminder of his minority status.
What stood out to you in Devin's story?
What's fascinating is that Devin sees living in Quebec as actually strengthening his Anglophone identity.
Oh, okay.
Because he's constantly surrounded by a different language and culture,
Mm-hmm.
he's become even more aware of his own English-speaking background.
So in a way, being in the minority has made him more conscious of his own identity.
Exactly. It's a reminder that identity is often shaped in relation to others,
Okay.
especially when you're part of a minority group.
Yeah.
And it speaks to how collective rights can protect and promote minority cultures,
Mm-hmm.
even in contexts where they're not the dominant force.
Right. So both Rachel's and Devin's stories highlight the lived experiences of language rights in Canada.
They do.
But now let's turn our attention back to the Metis and delve deeper into their unique struggle for recognition.
Okay.
We touched on some key historical events earlier,
Yeah.
but I'm curious to learn more about the legal battles they've fought and the challenges they've faced in asserting their collective rights. Where do we even begin to unpack all of that?
Well, remember that the Métis
Yeah.
don't have the same historical treaty relationship with the Canadian government
Right.
as First Nations. Their fight has often been about proving their distinct identity as an Aboriginal people
Mm-hmm.
and securing their rightful place within Canada.
And as we discussed, that fight was met with broken promises and government policies that undermine their rights.
Right.
The scrip system, for example,
Yeah.
was meant to provide land,
Uh-huh.
but it often resulted in dispersal and loss of community.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Those early injustices fueled a sense of injustice
Uh-huh.
that has carried through generations. And because of that, their fight for recognition is often played out in the courts.
So they've had to turn to legal challenges to force the government to recognize their rights.
In many ways,
Okay.
yes. And the turning point came with Section 35 of the Constitution Act, 1982,
Okay.
which finally acknowledged the Metis as one of Canada's Aboriginal peoples.
Right.
This was a landmark victory,
Okay.
as it provided a constitutional foundation for their claims.
So this was the moment they finally got that official recognition they had been fighting for.
Yes. And it paved the way for some significant legal victories.
Like,
Take the Powley case in 2003, for instance.
okay, yeah. Well, I remember we touched on the Powley case earlier, but I'd love to dive a little deeper. What were the legal arguments at play in this case?
Okay.
And why was the Supreme Court's decision so significant?
Well, the Powley case centered around Steve Powley,
Okay.
a Metis man from Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario,
Uh-huh.
who was charged with hunting moose without a license.
Mm-hmm.
He argued that he had an Aboriginal right to hunt based on his Metis ancestry. The Ontario government, however,
Yeah.
argued that the Métis in this area didn't have a historical connection to the land
Okay.
that would give them hunting rights.
Mm.
The Supreme Court ultimately sided with Powley, ruling that the Metis are a distinct Aboriginal people
Okay.
with inherent rights protected by Section 35 of the Constitution.
So this wasn't just about hunting moose.
No.
It was about recognizing the Métis as a rights-bearing people with a
Exactly.
unique history and connection to the land.
The court established a test
Okay.
to determine whether a Metis community has a right to hunt or fish.
Uh-huh.
A test that takes into account factors like self-identification,
Okay.
community acceptance,
Mm-hmm.
and historical connection to a specific territory.
Right.
The Powley case set a precedent for future claims,
Okay.
not just related to harvesting rights,
Right.
but for other Metis rights as well.
It sounds like a real turning point in the fight for Metis rights, but their legal battles didn't end there, did they?
Not at all. The fight for land compensation stemming from the Manitoba Act is ongoing. The Métis have been seeking redress for the land they were promised but never received.
And what's the latest on that front?
A recent Supreme Court ruling
Uh-huh.
has sided with the Métis,
Okay.
affirming that the government failed to live up to its obligations under the Manitoba Act. This doesn't immediately grant them the land back,
Right.
but it's a significant legal victory that could pave the way for negotiations and potentially some form of compensation.
So while they've won a major legal battle,
Yeah,
the fight for justice and reconciliation continues.
it does. The Métis, like other groups seeking to assert their collective rights, face ongoing challenges, from navigating complex legal processes to overcoming deeply ingrained biases and misunderstandings about their history and identity,
Right.
and to truly understand the complexities of what it means to be Métis in Canada today.
Uh-huh.
We need to hear from those who are living it.
You're right. Let's hear from some voices within the Metis community who can provide insights into their unique challenges and triumphs. Who are we going to hear from?
We have insights from Audrey Poitras, president of the Métis Nation of Alberta,
Okay.
and Gerald Cunningham, president of the Métis Settlements General Council. Both have been on the front lines of the fight for Métis rights and offer powerful perspectives on what it means to be Métis in Canada today. What's striking about Audrey Poitras is her passion and conviction. She's been a strong advocate for Métis rights for decades.
I'm eager to hear her perspective.
Right.
What are some of the key points she raises?
One thing she emphasizes is the importance of self-definition,
Okay.
the right of the Métis to determine who they are rather than having that imposed on them by external forces.
Yeah,
This is about reclaiming their narrative and asserting their agency.
that makes sense. It's about taking control of their own story
Right.
and defining their own identity.
Exactly. And she highlights how the recognition of Métis rights
Uh-huh.
has been intertwined with a resurgence of pride and a renewed connection to their heritage. It's not just about legal victories.
Yeah.
It's about reclaiming their identity and place in Canadian society.
So it's about cultural revitalization as well.
Yes.
About rediscovering and celebrating their unique heritage.
Absolutely. However, Poitras is also clear-eyed about the challenges that lie ahead.
Okay.
She acknowledges that while securing harvesting rights was a crucial step, the fight is far from over.
What are some of the ongoing struggles she highlights?
She points out that there's still work to be done
Okay.
in terms of fully realizing their collective rights and achieving self-governance. The Métis Nation of Alberta is still working towards a self-government agreement with the federal government,
Uh-huh.
something that would give them greater control over their own affairs.
It sounds like there's still a long road ahead
Yeah.
in terms of achieving their goals. Now, what about Gerald Cunningham?
Okay.
What perspective does he bring to this conversation?
Cunningham focuses on the significance of the Métis settlements in Alberta.
Okay.
Remember these settlements? Established in 1990,
Uh-huh.
provided permanent land bases
Right.
and a degree of self-governance for Métis communities.
Yes, we touched on that earlier. It was a landmark achievement, finally giving them a place to call their own.
Exactly. Cunningham sees this as a major step forward, but he's also realistic about the ongoing challenges.
What are some of those challenges?
Well, he talks about the need for continued advocacy and education to ensure that Métis rights are understood and respected. He emphasizes the importance of collaboration,
Okay.
of Métis communities across Canada working together to define their rights and push for greater recognition.
So for him, it's about unity and collective action to achieve their goals.
Precisely. And he acknowledges that it's an ongoing battle. He points to narrow interpretations of Métis rights by some provinces and the ongoing need to challenge stereotypes and misconceptions about Métis people.
It sounds like he's calling for a shift in how the Metis are perceived and treated in Canada.
He emphasizes the importance of recognizing the Métis as a distinct people with a unique history, culture, and set of rights. Both Poitras and Cunningham embody the resilience and determination of the Métis people. They're not just leaders. They're voices for a community that has been marginalized and overlooked for too long. Their stories are a reminder that even in the face of adversity, the fight for justice and recognition can prevail. But their insights also offer valuable lessons for all Canadians about the importance of understanding and respecting the diverse tapestry of cultures and identities that make up our nation.
I think it's important to step back and acknowledge that these are just a few voices within the Métis community. And while their perspectives are invaluable, it's crucial to remember that individual experiences can vary widely.
You're absolutely right.
Yeah.
Within any group, there will be a diversity of opinions, experiences, and priorities. It's important to avoid generalizations and to approach each story with an open mind and a willingness to listen and learn.
That's a great point. It's about embracing the complexity and acknowledging that there's no single Metis experience. And this brings us back to the broader conversation about collective rights in Canada. It's a complex and constantly evolving landscape, isn't it?
It is. We've explored the historical foundations of these rights,
Yeah.
delved into legal frameworks,
Yeah.
and heard from individuals navigating these complexities.
Right.
But what I find truly fascinating
Yeah.
is how these rights are not static. They're dynamic forces that are constantly being negotiated, reinterpreted, and fought for.
It's an ongoing dialogue, a conversation that involves all Canadians regardless of their background or identity. But what I'm curious about is, where do we go from here? What are the next steps in this ongoing journey toward recognizing and upholding the collective rights of all Canadians?
That's the question we'll be exploring as we wrap up this deep dive into collective rights in Canada. We'll shift our focus from the past and present to the future, examining what we can all do to contribute to a more just and equitable society for all.
We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive.
We have.
We've gone from the historical roots of collective rights
Yeah.
to the very real challenges and triumphs people face today. It feels like we're at a turning point, doesn't it?
It does. You know there's a growing awareness of these issues
Yeah.
and a renewed commitment, at least in some circles, to addressing past wrongs and working toward a more just and equitable future.
But awareness is only the first step.
It is.
What comes next? How do we move from simply understanding collective rights to actually upholding them in a meaningful way?
That's the crucial question, isn't it?
Yeah.
And it's a question
Yeah.
that requires all Canadians to participate in the conversation.
Right.
And to be part of the solution.
So where do we even begin?
Well, one important step
Yeah.
is challenging our own assumptions and biases.
Right.
We all have them, whether we're conscious of them or not.
Yeah.
It's about examining how those biases might influence our perceptions of others and how we interact with different groups.
Yeah. You're right. It's about being honest with ourselves.
Yeah.
And recognizing that we all have work to do.
And being willing to listen to and learn from those whose experiences differ from our own.
Right.
Sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is simply listen with an open mind and heart.
That reminds me of Rachel and Devin.
Right.
The students we heard from earlier.
Yeah.
They represent different perspectives on language rights, but both stories highlighted the importance of empathy and understanding.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Their experiences.
Yeah.
As well as those of the Indigenous and Métis leaders we discussed.
Right.
Remind us that collective rights are not just abstract legal concepts.
Right.
They're about real people, real lives, and real struggles for recognition and equality.
So how do we translate this understanding into action? What can we as individuals do to make a difference?
It starts with education.
Okay.
Take the time to learn about the history and experiences of different groups in Canada.
Yeah.
Read books, watch documentaries,
Okay.
attend workshops.
Yeah.
There are so many resources available to us, and knowledge is a powerful tool.
So we need to take the initiative to educate ourselves. It shouldn't be someone else's responsibility to teach us.
I agree.
Yeah.
And once we have that knowledge,
Uh-huh.
we can start to challenge stereotypes and misinformation within our own circles.
Right.
Have those difficult conversations with family and friends.
Yeah.
Share what you've learned.
Okay.
Encourage others to educate themselves.
So it's about using our voices to amplify the voices of those who have been marginalized and overlooked.
Precisely.
Okay.
And we can support organizations and initiatives that are working to advance collective rights.
Yeah.
Volunteer your time.
Yeah.
Donate to the causes you believe in,
Okay.
or simply spread the word about their work.
So there are many ways to get involved. Even small actions can make a difference.
Every action counts.
Yeah.
And don't underestimate the power of simply being an ally.
Right.
Show up for events. Okay. Speak out against injustice
Yeah.
and let others know that you stand in solidarity with those fighting for their rights.
So it's about creating a culture of support and understanding.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And ultimately,
Yeah.
it's about recognizing that collective rights are not a threat to individual freedoms, but rather a foundation for a more just and equitable society for all.
It's been an incredible journey unpacking all of this. It's clear that the conversation about collective rights in Canada is far from over.
It's not.
But I feel like this deep dive has given me a better understanding of the complexities, the challenges, and the opportunities that lie ahead.
I hope so.
Yeah.
And I hope it's inspired you to continue engaging with these issues,
It has.
to challenge your own assumptions,
Yeah.
and to be an active participant in shaping a future where the collective rights of all Canadians are truly respected and upheld.
It definitely has. Thank you for guiding us through this intricate landscape and for reminding us that we all have a role to play in creating a more just and equitable Canada.
It's been my pleasure.
Well, that's all the time we have for today.
Okay.
Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.